Let's create our authentication repository for handling user logins and signups via email. Make a new folder called repositories. And inside this folder, we'll have our barrel file called repositories.dart, where we're going to be exporting two files for now. The first being auth base auth repository.dart, and the second file will be auth repository.dart. Now let's make the auth folder. And the auth folder will have base auth repository.dart and auth repository.dart. Base auth repository will be an abstract class, and this is going to hold all the method definitions for our auth repository. The first method we're going to have returns a stream user, and we get user from Firebase auth. And we're actually going to import the package with the prefix auth. And this is so we can tell the difference between our own user model and the user model Firebase gives us. So here we can put stream auth.user. And this will be a getter that returns a user. This user getter is a listener that's constantly listening to the current state of our Firebase authentication. Whenever a new user logs in or logs out, this method will give us the new Firebase user or no Firebase user. Next, we'll have a future that returns auth.user, sign up with email and password. And this will take in a string username, string email, and string password. Then we have another future auth user called login with email and password. And for this, we only need to take in a string email and string password. And the last function we're going to write is called logout. Now that we have all our method definitions, let's go create our auth repository. Class auth repository extends base auth repository. And here we can see we get the error message missing concrete implementations of base auth repository and all of the methods we just wrote. In order to quickly import all of these, we can hit Command period on Mac or Control period on Windows, and then select create for missing overrides. And now we have all of the methods. Now these methods were generated in alphabetical order, but I prefer to keep them in the same order we defined them. So user, then sign up, login, then log out. So I'm going to reorder these. And now let's pass in the dependencies that our auth repository relies on. First, we have final Firebase Firestore, and we need to import Cloud Firestore for that. Firebase Firestore. Next, we have Firebase Auth, and I realize that we need to prefix this with as auth again. And then for each of these users, we can just add the prefix auth. Final auth.firebase auth, Firebase auth. And then we can write our constructor. So auth repository takes in Firebase Firestore, Firebase Firestore, and auth.firebase auth, Firebase auth. And then we can put a colon after the last parentheses here and assign each Firebase Firestore to the passed in Firestore and Firebase auth to Firebase auth. If Firebase Firestore is null or Firebase auth is null, then we just want to instantiate the instance here. So we can write Firebase Firestore.instance, and same with auth. Now let's save that, and we can start our user implementation. Now our getter is going to be Firebase auth auth.user changes. And so if we hover over user changes, we can see that we're going to get notified about any changes to user updates. It provides events on all user changes, such as when credentials are linked, unlinked, or when updates to the user profile are made. And so this lets us get updates about the current state of our Firebase user without having to reload our application. And we haven't actually looked at what a Firebase user is. So if we command click into this, we can see a Firebase user has a display name, email, verified email, a boolean to check whether the user is anonymous, and a bunch of other data too, like a phone number, photo URL. And it's important to know that not all this data is going to be populated. So when our user signs up with email and password, we're not going to have data like their phone number or photo URL. The main data we're going to be focused on is the user ID, which is their unique identifier, and the email, which we saw at the top of the file here. Now let's continue with our implementation. We'll quickly add the logout implementation, which is just await Firebase auth dot sign out. And make sure logout is asynchronous, as we're awaiting the sign out here. For sign up with email and password and login with email and password, we have parameters that should be required. So we can add the @required decorator by doing @required, command period, and then import meta. And make sure both of these methods are asynchronous, because we're going to be returning a future auth user. For sign up with email and password, we're going to have a try catch block. And for the catch, we're going to be listening for two different types of exceptions. The first will be auth.firebase auth exception, catch error. And the second one will be a platform exception, catch error. In order to use the platform exception, we need to import Flutter services. To create a user within Firebase, we need to call await Firebase auth dot create user with email and password, where we pass in the email and the password. And now this would work if we just wanted to make the user in Firebase and have them authenticate successfully. However, we actually want to create a user document in Firebase with the user's username and email. So if we look at create user with email and password, we can see it returns a user credential. So let's have final credential is equal to create user with email and password. And then we can get the actual Firebase user off the credential by doing credential.user. And if we actually look at a user credential, we can see it has additional user info, a credential, which is the auth credential, and a user, which is the Firebase user, containing all the information about the user we know. And so inside the auth repository, we want to return this user. So we can write return user. And then to write to Firebase, we can access Firebase Firestore .collection. And here we're going to make a path called users, and then go into a document, user.uid, and then set the document data, where we have a username set to username, email, email, and then we're also going to add two more fields. One of them will be followers, and this will be a running tally of the user's followers, and then following. And this will be a running tally of the number of users a user follows. And by default, these should be 0 because the user is just signing up for the first time. Now, if you've never used Firebase before, this may not make sense to you, but when we implement login and sign up, I'll actually show you how all the documents are created and what they look like. So don't worry about that for now. Since we're going to be accessing the users collection throughout our app multiple times, we should turn this into a constant so we don't risk misspelling user and not going to the right collection. So let's erase that and write paths.users. Inside config, we'll make a new file called paths.dart. class paths, static const string, users is equal to users. And here we're going to be making a list of our top level collections. We'll be coming back to this file a lot to add more collection paths to avoid typos. And here we can import paths.dart. Now for these errors, we want to be able to throw a generic failure model. So it looks something like this. Throw failure, where we pass in a code, and our error has a code. So if you look at the Firebase auth exception, it has data like code and a message that we want to pass back to our UI. And then message will be error.message. And then we can do the same for platform exception here. But now we actually need to create this model. So inside our lib directory, we'll make a new folder called models. And this will have the barrel file models.dart. And the first model will be failure model.dart. We know that failure model should have a code and a message. And if we hover over message, it's a string, and code is also a string. Failure model will be class failure, and we'll have a final string code and a final string message. Let's make the constructor const failure, this.code, and we'll set it to an empty string if code is not passed in, and same with message. Let's say we want to compare two failure models. So we have failure 1 and failure 2. We couldn't just do failure 1 and check if it's equal to failure 2, because then we're not actually comparing the code and message. In order to properly do this, we'd have to do failure1.code and check if that's equal to failure2.code, and check if failure1.message is equal to failure2.message. And you can see as we add more variables, this would get pretty verbose. So an easier way to deal with this is to use equatable. So we can extend the equatable package, and now we can see it says we're missing the implementation of equatable.props. We can create the missing override, and to implement props, this is a list of objects, and we can see it's a list of properties that will be used to determine whether two instances are equal. And so all we have to do is add the properties we want to compare. And in this case, it's code message. Now we can compare two failure models by just doing failure 1 and check if it's equal to failure 2. And it will automatically compare the code and messages for us. And so equatable is super useful and saves us a lot of time because we don't have to write any boilerplate code. Let's also add stringify, and that's also from equatable. And stringify just prints out a readable format for our instance, so we can see all the different props. Back in Auth repository, let's import our models.dart file. And now we can move on to log in with email and password. This is going to be similar to signup. So we'll have a try catch block. And then we can actually copy our catches here. And to log in, all we have to do is call await Firebase auth dot sign in with email and password. Pass in the email and the password. And when this is called, we see we get the future user credential, and we need to return a user. So we'll do final credential and return a credential.user. If the sign-in fails for whatever reason, we can see a Firebase auth exception is thrown, where it could be an invalid email, the user is disabled, the user doesn't exist, or there's a wrong password. Then our failure object will be thrown. And that's the same for create user with email and password. We can see all these different Firebase auth exceptions. And now we finished our auth repository.